If you're talking about the most dangerous city in the US, St. Louis is at the top of the list. Back in 2019, this city was seeing almost 2,100 violent crimes per 100,000 people. And if that number don't make you pause, let us break it down. That's more than 5 times the national average. A lot of people say high poverty and racial segregation play a big role in why things are the way they are. And looking at the numbers, it's hard to argue. Homicides, they've been out of control. In 2019 alone, there were 194 murders, and just the city of St. Louis was responsible for 30% of Missouri's homicides, even though only 5% of the state lives there. Then came 2020, and things got even worse. That year, the homicide rate hit a 50-year high with 262 murders in a city of just 300,000 people. And almost 90% of those killings involved a gun. To put that in perspective, St. Louis's homicide rate was 16 times higher than the national average. But here's the thing, not every part of St. Louis sees this kind of violence. It's concentrated in certain areas, and if you look closer, it lines up almost perfectly with poverty and racial divides. St. Louis is broken into 79 neighborhoods, and people who live there rep their hoods hard. Places like Tower Grove South, Dutchtown, and Walnut Park. But the most dangerous areas, those are the ones full of abandoned homes, where jobs are scarce and survival is a daily battle. And that's where the gangs move in. Now, when people think of gangs, they picture the Crips and Bloods, the ones with deep roots in places like LA, Chicago, and New York, where the big homies call the shots. But St. Louis, it's a whole different game. Here, there's no real hierarchy. Most of these dudes aren't following orders from some big boss. They're doing their own thing, robbing, hustling, and putting in work for themselves, not for some organized gang structure. The younger ones, they don't even have clear loyalties. One day, they're with one crew. The next day, they're on their own. They might throw a name on it, but at the end of the day, it's just about surviving. Back in the day, gangs had some kind of structure. You knew who was in charge, and you knew the mission. Now, it's just chaos. Dudes out here killing each other, and half the time, it isn't even about gang business. Police estimate there are about 2,000 gang members spread across 121 different gangs in St. Louis. But if you zoom out and include St. Louis County, St. Charles County, and even parts of Illinois, that number jumps to 3,000 to 5,000 gang members, repping around 600 different gangs. But the chaos in St. Louis today didn't happen overnight. It has roots, deep ones, and it all traces back to a gang so ruthless they didn't just control the streets, they ran the entire city, bottom gangs. St. Louis in the early 1900s was a city where politics and crime went hand in hand, and one of the first real street gangs to come out of that mix was the Bottoms Gang. They got their name from the rough neighborhood they called home, the Badlands or the Bottoms, a low-lying part of town full of bars, brothels, and gambling spots. Back then, gangs weren't just about street fights and robberies. They were tied into the political machines that ran the city. And at the center of it all was a man named Bad Jack Williams. Bad Jack wasn't your typical gangster. He started out as a detective, but somewhere along the way, he flipped and became the muscle for one of the most powerful political bosses in St. Louis, Colonel Ed Butler. If Butler wanted something done, Bad Jack made it happen. His crew ran out of a bar on 19th and Chestnut, running the streets until Missouri's Attorney General, Joseph Folk, took them down in 1904. By then, most of the Williams gang was either dead or locked up. But one guy made it out, Frank Hussey. Now Hussey was different. He wasn't just another street thug. He had brains. He was only 25, but he had gone to college, studying political science and business at St. Louis University. That same year, he got elected to the St. Louis House of Delegates. But instead of playing clean politics, he followed the old blueprint, using street muscle to get his way. And his right-hand man, his half-brother, Lawrence Lawler Daley, a tough guy with deep political connections. Most of the Bottoms gang came from the city's 22nd Ward, and their leader, Anthony Foley, was only 20, but already had a reputation as one of the toughest street fighters around. His crew, Red McAuliffe, Richard McLaughlin, and the Carroll brothers, was young, reckless, and ready to prove themselves. By 1905, they were making noise all over the city, pulling off burglaries, robberies, and beatdowns. While Hussey was stirring up trouble in politics, Foley and his crew were running the streets. They weren't just fighting rival gangs, they were making money too, running the numbers game in the black neighborhoods around the Bottoms. It was an illegal lottery, and Lawler Daley controlled it, running his operation out of the Hibernia Literary and Social Club, which doubled as the Bottoms gang's headquarters. But the Bottoms gang had a problem: Egan's rats. They were bigger, meaner, and more connected. Frank Hussey had hated their leaders, Snake Kenny and Tom Egan, for years. Back in 1900, Hussey had been shot in a street fight with the Kenny gang, and the wound never fully healed. It would randomly start bleeding, a constant reminder of unfinished business. So when primary elections rolled around in 1906, the Bottoms gang marched into the 15th Ward and threw down with the rats at the polls. The fight lasted all day. While Hussey was battling Egan's crew, Tony Foley had a personal war with the cops. It all started when his younger brother Tim was killed while robbing a newsstand in 1906. Tony believed the police let his brother's killer walk free, and from that moment on, he made it his mission to get back at them. One night in February 1907, he and his boys jumped a patrolman named Patrick Stapleton and nearly beat him to death. When the press asked him about it, Foley just called Stapleton a liar and a four-flusher. But Foley's luck ran out. He got convicted and sent to prison. By early 1907, Tom Egan started flexing his connections in the police department, making life miserable for the Bottoms gang. Their gambling dens kept getting raided, and then, on January 15th, both gangs met for a so-called peace talk. It didn't last. Right after the meeting, Tom Egan shot and killed an old rival, Willie Gaddrell. Then came one of the wildest stunts the Bottoms gang ever pulled. In 1908, Eddie Carroll and some of his guys walked into the police's Jefferson Club at dawn and smashed every window. Then, later that morning, they rolled up to City Hall in a fancy coach, stormed in waving guns and whips, and started looking for a man named Louis Marks, who had just fired Carroll. When they couldn't find him, Carroll shrugged and said, "The guy we're looking for isn't here." Then they casually went to a bar down the street and got arrested while having a drink. The cops were closing in, so the gang packed up and moved their headquarters to an old church they rebranded as the West End Athletic Club. One night, the place was packed, drinks flowing, folks singing, when a cop named John Hutton rolled up, telling them to quiet down. That didn't sit right. A fight broke out, and Connie Sullivan pulled a gun, shooting Hutton twice. The cop survived, but he was never the same. That was it. The state wasn't playing anymore. They rounded up most of the gang. Frank Hussey ran to Illinois, but it didn't matter. They caught him, Bev Brown, and Charles Norton, and dragged them back. Hussey managed to dodge charges for the shooting, but his political career was finished. A couple of years later, out of nowhere, he dropped dead from internal bleeding. By 1916, the Bottoms gang was barely hanging on, and their final war came from inside their ranks. Harry Cherry's Dunn, once an Egan's rat, flipped sides and took shelter with the Bottoms. But loyalty runs deep in the streets, and his old boss, Willie Egan, wasn't about to let that slide. Egan tracked him down at an after-hours joint and had him gunned down. 3 weeks later, the new Bottoms leader, Eddie Schonborn, caught a bullet too. Just like that, it was over. The few who made it out either joined another crew or disappeared into history. Some popped back up in a new outfit, the Cuckoo Gang, but the Bottoms Gang, that chapter was closed. Nowadays, these new crews are on a whole different level. Way more reckless, way more ruthless, and the body count higher than ever. Let's get into some names you need to know. 55 Boys. The 55 Boys might not have been a household name in St. Louis, but if you were in the south part of the city and dealing with fentanyl, you knew exactly who they were. They weren't just moving product, they were caught up in the violence too. Getting shot at, doing the shooting, running the streets like they owned them. At the center of it all, 2 names, Devontae Jizzlebucks Lindsay and Andre Lou Half Pearson. Lindsay, a local rapper, wasn't just making music. He was rapping about the gang, about dealing fentanyl, about the life they were really living. Alongside Pearson, he helped build the 55 Boys by pulling together members from other gangs. Young Project Goons, Team Knockout, The Strip, Pressure Gang, Cave. Basically, they were stacking up soldiers to control the fentanyl game. But this wasn't just some loosely organized street crew. The 55 Boys ran like a business. Lindsay and Pearson were the faces of it, but behind them were 3 managers overseeing 13 workers, plus 3 family facilitators, keeping things in check. At one point, these dudes were responsible for a huge chunk of the fentanyl being sold in South Street. Louis, that kind of money and power, it gets attention. By 2021, St. Louis police were already watching. But what really blew the case open was when the ATF arrested someone with substances and guns during an unrelated investigation. That got the feds looking deeper, and pretty soon they teamed up with the IRS's Criminal Investigation Unit, because where there's big substance money, there's always money laundering. When the hammer finally dropped, it dropped hard. Police hit multiple locations across the city, turning up over 24 guns, $120,000 in cash, thousands of fentanyl pills, and 2 cars bought with substance money. They even seized 2 houses connected to the operation, along with a 55 Boys chain covered in about 2,500 tiny diamonds, because of course they had to have something flashy to show off the empire they built. And just like that, the 55 Boys were done. When the dust settled, 15 members and associates were convicted and sentenced. Jizzlebucks, the rapper and gang leader, got 12 years. His right-hand man, Lou Half, got 11. People are saying these convictions will shake up how substances move through St. Louis. Maybe they will, but if history has taught us anything, it's that when one crew falls, there's always another one waiting to take its place. St. Louis Hood, downtown. Cass Avenue used to be lined with massive housing projects built in the 40s and 50s. These weren't just a few buildings, they replaced entire neighborhoods like Mill Creek Valley and DeSoto Car. But by the 70s and 80s, Cass Avenue had a whole new reputation. It was the roughest stretch in the city, a battleground where substance kingpins fought for territory and project wars ran deep. If you were from there, you knew exactly how it went down. Downtown had its own lineup of projects: Carr Square, Cochran, Blue Mire, Pruitt-Igoe, George Vaughan, Laclede Town, and later the O'Fallon Place Apartments. But Pruitt-Igoe, that one was on a different level. One of the biggest housing projects in the country, it was supposed to be a new stop for affordable living. Instead, it fell apart fast. Crime took over, the upkeep was trash, And by the late 70s, the city gave up on trying to fix it. They didn't just shut it down, they tore it down. St. Louis hood, the Ville. The Ville isn't just another neighborhood in St. Louis. It's history, straight up. A legendary black community, big enough to stretch across both the north and west sides of the city. Back in the day, it was a spot. We're talking about a place where greatness was just a regular thing. Musicians, athletes, entertainers, activists, you name it. People like Tina Turner and Chuck Berry, who basically gave rock and roll its heartbeat, came up through here. The Ville had it all, but time did its thing, and the Ville isn't what it used to be. A lot of it, especially south of St. Louis Avenue, is just empty now. But don't get it twisted, there's still life in it. You got pockets holding strong, like 41 LEX and 44 LEX over in Lexington, or 44 Ashland and 39 Ashland. People call it 3940. Then there's 4200 Moffett, and of course 44-2 Ville, the biggest stretch, running from the 4200 to the 4400 blocks. And that isn't even all of it. St. Louis hood, North City. The north side is where the city's heartbeat stays thumping, but it's also where the streets stay the most active. It's a web of rivalries, each neighborhood carrying its own history and beefs. You got G Street and the Walnut Park Bloods locked in. Then that split between the dub of JMV and DST. And let's not forget one of the city's first real Crip wars, rolling 60s and 62 East Coast Crips going at it, with OPAC and College and Carter right in the middle. Almost every part of the north side has something going on, except for a few like North Point, Penrose, and Hyde Park, where things stay a little quieter. But before all that, North City wasn't always like this. Back in the late 50s and early 60s, neighborhoods like O'Fallon Park and College Hill started filling up with black families moving in, carving out their space in the city. That wave didn't stop either. It just kept rolling into the 70s and 80s. Walnut Park, Barton, all those spots started getting more packed, especially after they tore down those old housing projects. St. Louis hoods, West Side. Back in the day, if you were talking about the West Side in St. Louis, you were talking about everything from Natural Bridge to Del Mar in the city. Once you crossed into the county, it was all the areas south of Interstate 70 and west of Keeneland Avenue. But long before the Bloods and Crips even touched down, St. Louis already had its own street gangs running things. Names like the West Side Rockers, the Hardy Boys, and the Boys of Destruction were well known in those streets. By the late 80s and early 90s though, things had shifted. Most of the West Side neighborhoods in the city had turned into blood territories. Spots like Horseshoe, Hodiamont, and Wellston were all under the red flag. But that didn't mean the Crips weren't around. You had some, mainly the rolling 60s, setting up in pockets along Goodfellow, especially on Wabata and Cates. Then, as time went on, those same gangs started spreading out from the city into the county, moving into neighborhoods along Natural Bridge and Page Avenue, places like Pagedale, Hillsdale, Pine Lawn, University City, and Wellston. But before the West Side even became majority black, there was a different kind of division going on. Back then, Taylor Boulevard was the invisible line separating black and white neighborhoods. If you were black, your options were limited. You had the Ville, Finney Avenue, and not much else. That started changing in the late 50s and 60s when black families began moving into areas along Page Boulevard, like Fountain Park, Academy, and the West End. And by the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, they had pushed even further, making their way into the county, reshaping the entire West Side in the process. St. Louis hoods, South Side. The South Side has always been mostly white, at least back in the day, but before the Bloods and Crips ever touched the city, there were already neighborhoods holding it down as the original South Side hoods. Spots like Gibson, Park Avenue, Grape Hill over by 2600 Hickory, the Dark Side, Comac, Peabody, back when the old Darst Webb projects were still standing. Those were the real foundations. Then the shift started. In the 80s and 90s, white families began moving out of the state streets, the 3rd District part of the South Side, down past Gravois and east of Grand Boulevard. That opened the door for new neighborhoods to pop up even further south through the 90s and 2000s. And now, with gentrification creeping into those original South Side hoods, the state streets have been stretching out, reaching deeper and deeper south, almost touching South Street, Lewis County, St. Louis hoods, North County. Back before the 70s, if you were black in North County, you were pretty much living in Kinloch or Robertson. That was just the way things were. But then came this big plan to expand the airport. Sounds major, right? Except it never actually happened. What did happen? Whole neighborhoods got wiped out. Homes, businesses, communities, gone. When the dust settled, Kinloch was left with just a handful of small housing projects, and Robertson, it was pretty much erased. So by the time the 70s rolled around, black families had to find somewhere else to go. That's when you started seeing more of them moving into Berkeley. Then came the 80s, and that's when things started shifting. See, apartment buildings started popping up all over North County, especially between Parker Road and Lucas Hunt. And once those apartments came in, things changed fast. White families, a lot of them packed up and moved further out. West County, St. Charles County, places like that. And as they left, more black families moved into areas like Jennings, Riverview, Spanish Lake, Delwood, Parker Road, and all the neighborhoods in between. That shift didn't happen overnight, but by the time the 2000s hit, North County looked a whole lot different than it did just a few decades before. Now, growing up in St. Louis, joining a gang wasn't really a choice. It was just part of where you lived. It wasn't about pledging loyalty to one set either. You didn't get jumped in or prove yourself with some wild crime. It was just life. And those turf wars you hear about in other cities, not really how it works here. No one gang runs a whole block. It's more like open season. Whoever's outside is outside. Yeah, dudes still rep their colors. But according to the cops, getting killed over wearing the wrong one in the wrong spot isn't as common anymore. What has changed, though, is how these gangs operate. It's not just street corners and secret handshakes, it's Instagram posts and tagged up walls. Instead of proving themselves with violence, a lot of them flex online. Guns, money, graffiti. If it looks good for the gram, it's fair game. Lately though, crime's been cooling off a bit. The cops got these new flock cameras posted up all over the city. High-tech license plate readers that flag any car tied to a crime. The second one rolls through, cops get the alert and they're on it. And word is, it's been bringing the numbers down. Appreciate you watching. If you liked it, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.